the world's writers will walk through those gates. And if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There's some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
I hope you enjoy your events in this year's digital programme and that they spark in you thoughts and conversations and feelings. All the things that a good book should do and all the things that a wonderful book festival like Edinburgh International Book Festival does too. It's a book festival that's really dear to my heart. It's one of the first festivals I attended as a new author. I was part of their Outriders Africa programme, and every year returning to it feels a little bit like coming back to a literary home. It's such a pleasure to see them going online this year, and I'm so excited for the future of Edinburgh International Book Festival.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Somini Sengupta. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you from whatever time zone and continent you're joining from. Welcome to this panel with Christiana Figueres, Tom Rivett-Carnac, the authors of The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis. Let me not forget to tell you that this panel is made possible with support from the Scottish Mortgage Investment Trust. Let me also remind you that we're going to be taking your questions, audience members, at the end of this conversation. So please think of some good ones and throw them at us. So a very, very quick intro before we dive into the surviving part of this conversation. Christiana, you were born at the end of one geological epoch, the Holocene, as you say in the book. You're the daughter of a former president of your country, Costa Rica, which is where you're joining from now. And you led the diplomatic negotiations that led to the landmark Global Climate Agreement in Paris in 2015. Can't believe that was nearly 5 years ago. Tom, you were born at the beginning of another geological epoch, the Anthropocene, which is the epoch that we have created to a great extent at our own peril. You're from London. You're joining us from the west of England today. And you spent a couple of years training to be a Buddhist monk, and you worked alongside Christiana as a political strategist. And you sat through, like she did, hours and hours of international negotiations. So a big welcome to the both of you.
Thank you, Somini. It's wonderful to be here in a new way at the Edinburgh Book Festival, and thank you for inviting both of us to be here.
I want to start really by asking you what I would ask you if you were sitting around my table, which is, how are you in this extraordinary time? And what has this period of intense isolation taught you? Have you learned anything about yourself, or have you changed your mind about anything or anyone?
What a beautiful question, Somini. I must say that I every morning am incredibly grateful that I decided very early on to come back to Costa Rica because I haven't lived here in 40-something years. And I decided when all the airports were closing down, I decided, maybe this is the time to go home. And it was a good decision. Costa Rica has weathered the pandemic relatively well, with the huge painful exception of those in the informal sector that are currently being supported by the government, but that are definitely the ones that are most vulnerable to the pandemic and to climate change, by the way. Always those at the bottom rung of the ladder are the ones that are more impacted. But I personally wake up and feel incredibly grateful to be in a country that is democratic, that is well run, that has so much nature around us, and I am surrounded by beautiful nature, both flora and fauna, and I feel very grateful to be able to spend the pandemic like this. In addition to that, in the company of my daughters, who wouldn't be here had we not had the pandemic. So many, many hidden blessings.
Tom?
Yeah, so again, what a lovely way to start, and great to be here and to see you, Somini. So I'm, very fortunate in the big scheme of things in terms of, how I've been spending this pandemic. I live in the west of England, as you said, so I've been locked down with my family. I have 2 young children. I live in a rural area, so I've been able to swim in the river and go running. So, you referenced my time as a Buddhist monk in the introduction there, and I think rather than learn something, I've sort of remembered something, and that's just that at a lower level of intensity. I mean, like so many people, I've been trying to make a difference on climate change for such a long time, running around the world, doing a variety of different things, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's been great, and I feel we've had an impact. But being able to stop like this and stay still, see my kids, see the spring arrive, see an entire progress from winter to spring to summer to now the beginnings of fall in one place, seeing the same tree over that time period. I mean, at the beginning of the lockdown, a lot of people were saying, oh, nature's returning, things are coming back. But of course, what was happening was they were seeing it for the first time in a long time, and they were paying attention. I actually, near the beginning of the lockdown, I wrote a children's book or a poem called What Happened When We All Stopped. And Ted made it into an animation, and Jane Goodall narrated it. And it's all about this moment of remembering that we see the world and we see kind of what we've done, but this great pause gives us a chance to now do things differently.
It's a wonderful book, I say so. Highly recommended to download it. It's available on our website, on the Global Optimism website, and it really is. It's totally delightful for kids, but it's also delightful for adults.
Speaking of stopping, sorry, I think we have a little bit of a delay. But I was going to say, speaking of stopping, I stopped working one day this week and took a walk to a botanical garden in New York City. And I took a walk through the wetlands in that garden. And it occurred to me that we are a little bit in a transitional place now, similar to what the wetlands are. Not quite water, not quite land, sort of in the middle, trying to decide, what it's going to be. And I wanted to ask you to read from sort of towards the end of the book. You describe this moment that we are in. So, Tom, if I could ask you to read just those 2 paragraphs that with which you begin your conclusion.
Sure, I'm very happy to. And this is the British cover of the book. There's a different one in the US. And this doesn't relate to this moment because, of course, the book was written pre-COVID, but actually it applies very well to this moment, as you've pointed out. This is the beginning of the final chapter called A New Story. We want you to know 2 things. First, even at this late hour, we still have a choice about our future, and therefore every action we take from this moment forward counts. Second, we are capable of making the right choices about our own destiny. We are not doomed to a devastating future, and humanity is not flawed and incapable of responding to big problems if we act.
You go on in this chapter to say that we will look back at this moment as, quote, the single most significant turning point for action. Could one of you explain, Jens, why is this the single most important? What does the science say about this moment? What makes it so important?
Well, you started off, Somini, by reminding us that we come from 2 geological periods. That is part of the context why the moment that we're in is so critical. Because the geological period that we're living in now, that wasn't the one that was operative when I was born, but the one that we're living right now, which is the Anthropocene, is the geological period in which we humans have taken control of what happens to nature. We still don't control everything in nature, but a lot of what happens in nature is actually being exacerbated and multiplied by what we are doing. And we have done that long enough to be now on the brink of taking nature over quite a few thresholds into conditions that would have been completely unnatural, sorry to use that word, unnatural for nature. Now, what science tells us is that brink, that threshold, could easily happen over the next 10 years. So over the next 10 years, we are going to have to cut our global greenhouse gas emissions, but also our personal and our city emissions and our country emissions by 50%. Everyone needs to cut by 50%.
At minimum.
So that by 2050, sorry?
Or more, 50% or more.
Yeah, 50% at least, especially in developing countries, certainly 50% or more, and certainly by 2030 or sooner, so that we can get off the trajectory that we're on of constant destruction and be able to open the door to a world that has the capacity to be much more resilient and regenerative. But if we don't, then we have basically sealed our fate, and we would not be able to make those changes where, for example, the Amazon, beautiful as it is and long-standing as it is, could tip over into being a savanna. or we will lose all the ice, all the winter ice in the Arctic. Changes like that are irreversible could very easily occur. And that starts a whole domino effect that is very difficult to foresee how much damage that would make, certainly to nature, but primarily to the living conditions of human beings. That is why it is so important, because here we're not trying to save the planet. Even if the Amazon turns into a savanna, even if we don't have any more ice on the Arctic, the planet will continue in very different conditions, but it will continue because it has over 4.5 billion years changed remarkably many times. The problem is that humans cannot adapt to those drastic changes that would occur. And so we would have a very hard time living on a planet and in a world that is largely uninhabitable to human beings.
So the science says our best shot at surviving the climate crisis is to make this radical change, a series of radical changes in the next 10 years by 2030. I mean, the physical world doesn't have a hard and fast deadline.
Yeah, I would
right?
argue science doesn't say it's our best shot. Science says it is our only shot. There are more than 100 different paths to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, but all of them go through the eye of one needle. And that needle is halving emissions by 2030. And then there are many different paths. So science is not saying this is one path, you can choose it or you can choose something else. No, science is saying this is it. You have pushed nature to such an extent that unless you're able to cut global emissions by 1/2 by 2030, there is no chance that you will be able to pull nature back from that brink.
And can I just add something?
Yes, please.
I mean, you know, one of the challenges with the environmental movement is that there seems to have been warning after warning, right? I mean, people who are skeptical of this will say, oh, you said that in 1992, or you said that at some other time. And of course, the challenge is that it was already serious in 1992. We could already see the trajectory when the UN first created its Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is a sort of landmark year in the process of trying to deal with this through an international climate regime. But there is such a thing as being too late, right? We have failed again and again to really get on top of this in a really serious and consistent way. And the trouble with that is at the end, you reach a moment where it genuinely becomes the last opportunity to transform the path you're on. And if you don't, you can be too late and you can push the system to the point where actually the climate goes above 1.5 degrees, which is the point at which these really quite alarming feedback loops that Christiana is talking about start being flipped. And instead of absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they start emitting it. And at that point, you've effectively lost control of the climate system. And even if you reduce emissions after that point, you can no longer control the temperature gauge of the planet. So it really has come down to these 10 years, which is why they are, it sounds like hyperbole to say it's the most important decade in the history of humanity, but it's not. And we have to find a way to hear that and understand that.
I want to come back to that in a minute, but you brought up something that reminds me of this whole meme that is, in our zeitgeist, which is, whether it's too late to make a difference. Really, are we doomed? And there are those who argue that we've almost reached a point of no return. Average global temperatures are already more than 1 degree Celsius compared to the average global temperature 150 years ago at the beginning of the industrial age. So there's this whole, I think there are some people who would say, well, we've already reached, or we're very close to reaching that point. They are sometimes referred to as doomer bros because they tend to be largely men, you very categorically are on the other side of this. You reject that theory. Can you explain that a little bit? Why are you so confident that there is still time?
I'm not confident. I'm just incredibly stubborn about making it possible. There is no way to be confident of success here. Honestly, anyone who's confident about climate change has no idea what they're talking about. We are up against the most serious challenge we have ever been faced with. So confidence is not part of my backbone here. It's the fact that if we do not give it our all, if we do not harvest all our ingenuity, all our conviction, all our efforts to make the changes that are necessary, then I think just being horrendously irresponsible in already knowing where we might go and just sitting back and saying, oh, well, it's too late. Or, oh, well, I'm going to be indifferent because anyway, it's only my kids and their kids that are going to be affected, not me because I'm too old. I mean, honestly, can we really be that irresponsible? Had we started 20, 30, 40 years ago, we would have had a much easier way of getting out of this. But we didn't, or we didn't do fast enough. Yes, we have started very well. We have renewable energy that is now 25% of the grid worldwide. We're doing much better on electric vehicles. We're investing into batteries. Yes, we're showing that we know how to do this, and we have the technologies, and we have the capital, and we know what the policies are. So we are giving evidence to ourselves that we can do this. It's just that we're not walking fast enough. So the door is closing on us. And the door closing is a very good analogy of what we're talking about here, because when you have a fully open door and it begins to close, which is what we had in the 1990s, then scientists were saying the door is closing. Yes, the door was closing, but you can see that a door closes slowly. Now, we're basically this much from shutting the door. That's why it is important to make sure that that door is not shut in our face. We're this far away from shutting the door, but we can squeeze through. Now, squeezing through means doing everything to be at 1/2 our emissions by 2030, but then it also means investing into what we call negative emissions. It also means investing into all of those technologies, nature being the safest, but also other industrial technologies that are going to absorb carbon out of the air, because we waited too long. Otherwise, we simply could have done it by reducing our emissions. Now we have to do both. We have to reduce our emissions and absorb.
I want to get to the surviving part. You have a series of actions that you put out in the book, and it really calls on everyone to reduce emissions by 60%. So I want to ask you, have you been able to reduce your emissions by 60%? Have you done that? What have you found easy to do? What's been the low-hanging fruit? What's been difficult? And then I'm going to tack on sort of a question to that, which is, how much do these individual actions matter anyway? So the first part, you can choose which of you want to answer that. But what have you done? What's been easy? What's been hard? What are the lessons for others?
Yeah, so I can have a go at that. So what we advocate in the book is not exclusively dealing with your personal emissions, but we do feel that it's important, right? And we can contextualize it among how we show up, what our personal emissions are, and how we engage with power, right? So looking at your personal emissions is just one part of that picture. But it's important because it can be significant, and also because it tends to keep you engaged in the issue if you're actually taking action and making it real in your life. Now, so what we say is that every individual, to be responsible and participate in this transformation in the way that we need to, needs to reduce their emissions by at least 60% in the next 10 years. Now, what we tend to do as human beings is overestimate what we can do in a year and underestimate what we can do in 10 years. Actually, if we say you need to reduce your emissions by 60% in the next 10 years, that's enough time. It's enough time because the emissions in your life generally come from the activities that you do and the major capital intensive items in your house. So your boiler, your car, your other sorts of things like that. 10 years is enough time to plan how you might make those transformations, change to electric vehicles, maybe even consider living somewhere else where your emissions can be lower, changing your boiler, going more electric. There's other big things you can do, or changing your lifestyle, the way you make money in a way that doesn't require you to reduce emissions. Now, I've been, like everybody, right, struggling with this for a long time. And we live inside a world that's fundamentally based on a fossil fuel economy. So you can only separate yourself out from it to a certain degree, right? So, I don't eat meat. That's a very easy one that I can now do, which has a big impact. My home is very well insulated. I use all energy efficient appliances and bulbs and other stuff in my house. I buy my electricity on a green tariff, which only costs a small amount more. I chose to buy a house in a village that has a train station, so I don't have to use my car very much, although I do own a car, and I haven't been able to completely remove myself from owning a fossil fuel powered car, but I'd love to buy an electric car, which I will do in the next few years. The big challenge for me has been air travel. I mean, not in the course of the last 6 months, right? But prior to that, I've had to travel around the world, I felt, in order to make an impact. But there again, we've been trying to do certain things that make that less pernicious or allow you to change it over time. So a year ago, we started a weekly podcast called Outrage and Optimism that Christiana and I co-host with our good friend Paul Dickinson. And a significant part of the reason for starting that was so that we could build an audience so that we don't have to travel around the world in order to speak to people about the message. So there are different things you can do where you plan. It's not perfect. I'm not perfect. But actually, I found once you start getting into it and you start reducing emissions, it's not a burden at all. It's actually quite fun in a way. And I've heard that from many people, apart from just experiencing it myself. If you don't see it as this terrible thing you have to do, but actually something you can get on top of to make the future better, there's more is possible to change in your life in a shorter time period than most people realize.
Tom, have you changed your mind about air travel in these last 6 months? Because after all, the three of us are part of the 6% that you describe, the 6% of the world's population that gets on airplanes.
Yeah.
With a huge carbon footprint. So I wonder if that, if it's given you pause about how much you might get on an airplane in the future, or whether you might give that up entirely.
Absolutely. So I cannot imagine that I will ever go back to traveling like I used to. I think that a significant majority of the things that I used to do can now be done remotely and increasingly well, right? I mean, air travel is what it is, but I found over the course of the last 6 months, the technology, the way people can engage remotely has really improved. And that's going to continue to get better and better, which is really exciting and enables us to do things like live in Costa Rica in Christiana's case and still participate in the Edinburgh Book Festival. However, on the other hand, I would say that travel around the world is something that has made our culture richer overall. And that cultural exchange, that ability to go to other places and experience other cultures, is something that we should applaud and celebrate. And I realize that there's a tension there. So I don't think that I have resolved that. Will I never get on a plane again? I expect I will, but I think it will be significantly different compared to what it was in the past.
Christiana, can I ask you, what has been easy to do in reducing emissions for you, what you have found to be hard? And I want to just kind of spool back on this for countries, including yours, that have aspired very ambitiously to decarbonize their economies. Costa Rica has set a very specific target, principally by making changes in its transportation system. That happens to be the largest source of Costa Rica's emissions. That has proven to be very difficult. Some of this change is hard, isn't it?
It is. Some of it, like I guess anything in life, some things are easy and all of us should be doing the easy things. And then you get to things that are sort of medium and some that are really tough. But that doesn't mean that, that you don't start right away with those things that can be done right away.
What's the medium and what's the really tough?
Well, the easiest to give up meat, right? We should honestly all be on plant-based diet, which we have as a family been for quite a few years now. So that's definitely very easy. I want to go into the transport piece because, like Tom, I used to travel enormously, just way too much. Now, when I look back at my travel schedule, especially my international flight travel, I'm just horrified by what I used to do. And I am absolutely determined not to repeat that again. I will have to be very, very choosing of when do I get on a plane, because now we can do most of our work, if not all of it, by Zoom or Teams or whatever other mechanism we choose. But I wanted to talk about transport, domestic transport, because I used to live in London, and London has a fantastic public transport system. When I think back to London, what do I miss most? The public transport system. I did not own a car. In fact, I had an electric vehicle before I moved to London. I gave it to someone in Germany, left it in Germany, because I decided I don't really need a vehicle in London. I'm just going to totally enjoy the public transport. A, it's more convenient. B, less emissions, because the electricity in England, in Britain, is still not 100% clean. Now, interestingly enough, I moved to Costa Rica. Costa Rica has 100% fossil fuels in all of our transport. And we have a very, very poor, or rather non-existent public transport. So since I had a very good habit of using public transport in London, one would say, well, maybe then you just move to public transport in Costa Rica. Wrong, because public transport in Costa Rica is much more carbon intensive than public transport in London. And even owning a car, a normal car here, would be more carbon intensive. So the low carbon option in Costa Rica is to get an electric vehicle. Why? Because our electricity is 100% clean. You don't get an electric vehicle and lower your carbon emissions in those jurisdictions in which the electricity is still coal-based or gas-based or whatever. You lower your carbon emissions with an electric vehicle if the electricity charging your vehicle is 100% clean. So I now have transport in Costa Rica domestically that is 100% clean. And I live between the city and here on the Pacific Coast. I have a charger in each of my homes. And the charger that I installed here on the Pacific Coast is made in Costa Rica. Why? Because Costa Rica is going for electric transport. And now we have a domestic manufacturing capacity for chargers. And we can take advantage of 100% renewable electricity. So
I mean,
you can't use the same measures everywhere. You really have to get under the hood and figure out what that you're doing is carbon intensive in the context in which you're living.
Also, it is beyond the reach of most people in the world to travel in an electric car, to buy an electric car. And, as you know, people who are forced in a country like Costa Rica or any country to take public transportation waste a lot of their time, put in a lot of their effort, and breathe a lot of air pollution. I want to ask about something that I've been thinking about, and I want to ask your take on this, and it's a slightly difficult one. It used to be said that big transformational change could be more easily carried out by authoritarian governments, that democracies were by definition too messy, that change would be incremental, that you'd have to get people to buy in. Now there's a theory that I'm hearing that intensifying climate change may be making authoritarianism more likely. I wonder if you have any thoughts on whether there's a relationship between these two, between the climate crisis and what is clearly a rising wave of authoritarian rule around the world.
Tom, do you want to go? I mean, I actually have a smile on my face because those authoritarian governments are not climate friendly at all. So, you know, in theory, you could say it's easier to address climate change with an authoritarian government, but what we see is actually quite the opposite. But anyway, Tom, I'm sure you wanted to jump in.
No. That was very much the point I was going to make, actually. And also that even in theory, you might be able to say that a very dictatorial government that has control of the levers of power will be able to implement all sorts of other changes that might create a green economy or a very dictatorial green economy. But as history has shown us, you need to be very careful thinking that that's all they're going to do. So I think that we would be very foolish to decide that an authoritarian strategy will solve those problems. I mean, it might be, theoretically, that in some places, some of them might be solved for a limited period of time. But the other problems that would be created by that would be absolutely astronomical in comparison to the solutions that get drawn out of it. The other point I would make is that many of the solutions that are now emerging are the result of the great forces of investment, entrepreneurship, and innovation being deployed towards these challenges and actually yielding these remarkable solutions, be they technological solutions, business model solutions, communities responding to these things in different ways. Authoritarian governments have a habit over time of stamping down on the freedom to try to innovate and create new solutions. So I think even though it might be easy to say this plus that seems to go in a straight line in that direction, a cursory glance at history would show that it's far more complicated.
One of the messages of your book, sorry, I want to ask you one thing before we run out of time. One of the messages of your book is that the radical change that we need to make to survive the climate crisis doesn't have to be frightening, right? That this kind of endless extraction of nature, reckless waste is actually not making many of us happy. I guess that made me think, yeah, but there are some trade-offs though. We may have to give up some things that do make us happy. And I wonder how you feel about that. Just to get back for a second to flying, if I couldn't fly anymore to see my cousins or my friends who live in another part of the world, that would be a cost. It might be a trade-off that some of us are willing to make, but there are some costs. So I wondered if you had a thought on that, either of you.
Well, I first of all, I don't believe in binary decisions, black and white. I'm never going to travel on the air again. It's just not realistic. So let's be rational about this. And I think Tom made a very important distinction. He distinguished between business travel and pleasure or family or nature travel. That's very, very different. And it's not me who's saying this. Airlines have realized that business travel as they used to have it, which was basically their main source of revenue, will not return to the levels that they had seen because so much business will now be conducted as we are conducting this conversation here today. So they are changing their business model. And in fact, they're going to have to change the interior design of their airplanes to be much more in accordance with the new business model that they're going to be moving forward with. I will definitely not be traveling for business or for my profession as much as before, but I do remain totally committed to getting on a plane and going and visiting my daughters, absolutely, or having them come down here. I also will still want to see some of the absolutely beautiful things of nature that I have not seen yet. But that will reduce my travel to 5% of what I used to do. So it's not that, this is not a black and white question. anymore at all. Like most things in life, there are many shades of gray. And I think my decision of not traveling for work as I used to, I'm not the only person thinking that. I think most business people who used to travel will be acting in that same way.
I mean, air travel is one example, but there are trade-offs. There are these decisions that we have to make. What do I do to reduce the risks that my community, the rest of humanity faces? And what are the trade-offs that I'm willing to make? Tom, did you want to add something on that?
Yeah, well, I think that I would think about it slightly differently. I mean, it's true in a sense that, nothing in the world is free, right? And to try to expect that a positive outcome comes for free is sort of, is a childish assumption that many of us have been guilty of making in the past, right? But speaking from my own perspective, I would say, actually participating in this great transformation, preserving the wonders of nature, creating a livable future for our children, seeing the regeneration of nature around us, those are all positives as well. And in all honesty, once you go through this process, some things can seem like a sacrifice. And then when you live through a transformation, they can appear different. I would not have said to you 6 months ago that I have had a much improved quality of life by not getting on a plane this year. But actually, now that I've lived through it and I haven't traveled so much, it's been better, right? And there's a whole variety of other things. There's a tendency to present these things as, oh, we're going to have to give something up, it's going to be really bad, etc. It's also possible to focus on the other side. What are we going to get? We're going to get clean air, we're going to get regenerated nature, we're going to get time with our kids. And, and the other elements that we still want, we're going to have to find a way to sort them out. But there will be other models to do that, right? I mean, I'm definitely going to go to see the whales outside Christiana's house at some point, but maybe I'll scoop my kids up and go for 9 months and work from there rather than going for a short period of time. So because now other transformations have happened in terms of the patterns of work. So it's such a complicated system. At the end of the day, it's worth doing what is necessary to create a regenerated, thriving world. And it's not a sacrifice to do that.
Christiana, you heard him say it. He's coming for 9 months with his kids. I hope you heard that. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the redesigned planes. I'm in favor of playgrounds at the back.
Before we jump to our excellent audience questions that are beginning to come in, I'm going to jump in with one kind of big picture question, and we have 3 minutes left. So please, a quick one. Now, you both know better than anyone that one of the major sticking points in international negotiations is the unfairness of climate change, right? We are not equally to blame for this problem. So Britain, for example, burned a lot of coal to become an industrial giant. It also extracted a lot of resources from its colonies to become an economic powerhouse and a diplomatic powerhouse. So how do you deal with that? Christiana, this is really, I want to really hear your thoughts on this. Do you say, well, some countries should be allowed to burn coal for a little while longer because they really didn't burn that much? Or do you say, well, the ones who aren't really responsible for climate change are owed something like compensation? Or do you say, you know what, we all have to do the same thing? How do you address this fundamental inequity?
Yeah, first let's talk about blame. I don't think that in a personal relationship or a professional or a political dynamic, pointing a blaming finger at anyone or any country or anyone is actually very helpful, because the only thing it does is put the other person or the other country on the defensive, and then you start this ping pong game of blaming. And so in order to get to the Paris Agreement, we had to deal with that dynamic. And it wasn't easy, but eventually where we landed was in absolutely, totally accepting what we call historical responsibility. There is no doubt that it was the industrialized countries that benefited the most from the burning of fossil fuel and from the comforts that come from economic development based on the burning of fossil fuel. And there's no doubt that they derived most benefit and that they were the most, during that time, that they were the most highly emitting. No doubt No, that's not a myth, that's not a belief, that's just mathematical and physical certainty. So no point in trying to shove that fact under the rug. Let's accept historical responsibility for what it is. Now, historical responsibility looks back. And it's very difficult to change the past. Try if you can. You cannot change the past. So while you respect, and all countries decided they would respect historical responsibility and not question it, at the same time, you put side by side with historical responsibility, you put side by side with that future responsibility. And that's a different issue because every person, every nation, every city, every corporation has future responsibility. Differentiated for sure, but everyone has future responsibility. So that is the way that you can actually both respect and acknowledge historical responsibility, but also stand up to the future responsibility and to the future solution space that we can all participate in. They are not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. And that is the space that we got to in order to be able to adopt the Paris Agreement. It's true between you and me, and it's true between countries that what has passed, but we can all accept some responsibility to build a different future, and we all must participate in building a new future.
There are some really interesting questions that are coming in, so I want to take a couple of minutes to address those. Here's one. How do you feel about the burden of mitigation, which is reducing emissions, the burden of mitigation imposed on consumers versus corporations? Without government mandates, I worry individuals easily become disillusioned with their personal efforts. So how do you avoid this?
So it's a good question, and it's true, right? Individuals can't solve this on their own, but it's also true that we can't solve this without individuals. So what we talk about in the book is that it is very important for individuals to get on board with this process for a few different reasons. One is because there is a tendency now for us to feel somewhat disconnected from and depressed about the situation that's happening on climate change. Studies have shown that people who get engaged in the issue, start taking action, take responsibility for their own footprint, actually tend to feel better about the entire issue and tend to do more as well. So what we say in the book is we have 3 steps that everybody has to be involved in. I'll summarize them very briefly. The first is how we show up. This is the most consequential moment in human history, and we get to live through it, right? That is not a burden. That is an enormous opportunity and an enormous privilege. And we can show up with energy and determination, prepared to play our part in these critical years. So we would encourage everybody to adopt that attitude towards this if we're going to be successful. The second part is around reducing emissions, which I've already talked about, the 60% over 10 years, that we do think is important both for remaining engaged and also if enough people do it, it can actually be very significant in terms of emissions. The third part is about engaging with power. We all need to play constructive roles in speaking to corporations and speaking to governments, in raising our voices, participating in protests, yes, voting, of course, but more than that, getting involved as many ways as we can at whatever level we can reach to try to make our voices heard, to try to put that across to those in power that they need to treat this like an emergency and take urgent action. So I think I would not say there can't be a dichotomy of is it individuals, is it governments, is it corporations? It's an emergency and it needs to be everyone.
Speaking of voting, we are barely 2 months away from the US election. I think a lot of people are wondering if Donald Trump is reelected to a second term, what does that do to efforts to reduce emissions as quickly as is necessary by 2030?
Well, there is no doubt that would be a handbrake to global emission reductions.
A handbrake, you said, a handbrake.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, it hasn't been that over the past 3.5 years because, first of all, there are no other countries that have decided that they also want to exit the Paris Agreement. most countries have understood that reducing emissions is good for their economy and is certainly good for the health of their citizens. So they have marched on and continued their decarbonization. Inside the United States, we also have most of the states, both on the East Coast as well as on the West Coast, which are the largest economies by state, that have continued to decarbonize because they understand that it's better for their economy and helpful for their citizens. And you have more than 300 corporations in the United States that have continued to decarbonize, and many of the large economies coming now with very ambitious targets, such as Amazon for 2040, Apple and Microsoft for 2040, for 2030, sorry. You have many of them understanding and realizing that this is the best thing that they can do for business continuity, not to save the planet, but for business continuity. So it hasn't been, I would guess that the United States would have reduced many more emissions had the White House been of a different opinion about the benefits of reducing emissions. But it has not been a showstopper for the United States. It has also not been a showstopper internationally, as I said, because most countries have continued. I question whether we would have the same situation if we have 4 more years of obstreperous position in the White House. I actually am concerned about that because I think China, for one, has continued to reduce, but they are waiting to see what happens in the United States, because the big question for them is there going to be someone who they can collaborate with and coordinate with on emissions reductions? And many other countries are also sort of playing the waiting for Godot game. So I am frankly concerned. I am concerned that should we have 4 more years of this obstreperous position in the White House, that we would not be able to move forward as fast as we should. So I'm very frank about my concern.
That is to say, this election matters not just to the citizens of the United States, but to citizens of
the world.
The world. Question about COVID-19. Do you think the lessons learned from COVID-19 and the local community efforts to build resilience will translate into actions to tackle the climate crisis? If so, what are those? And I guess the flip side of that question would be, has COVID-19 set back global efforts to address climate change?
So I think that, when in the early days of the pandemic, that we were extremely, extremely optimistic or extremely hopeful about the green recovery packages and the fact that they could actually shape the economy in very positive ways that would create all sorts of benefits and accelerate climate action. Those have not come completely true. It's been a mixed picture, but there has been a lot of bad decision making on the parts of lots of governments.
Very mixed picture.
Right. I mean, 151 billion to support fossil fuels. And only a fifth of that with any environmental requirements by last count, as far as I saw. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges with it. There are some good stories too, but it hasn't been the overwhelming transformation we hoped for. Now, the big positive, however, to come out of COVID-19, and this is carried out in study after study, is that the trust in science and the faith in science from people who previously were not trustful science, and we kind of had a crisis of confidence in the ability to trust objective science prior to the pandemic, has had a significant uplift. And actually taking action to avert something that you can see coming down the road has enormous parallels with the climate crisis. We talked to Yuval Harari on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about whether this was the black swan event, the pandemic. Actually, this was the most predicted event in history in many ways. People have been predicting a pandemic like this for decades, but we failed to prepare. So it is an ideal model in many ways of what happens when you see a risk, you don't listen to science, and you don't prepare. And that, I think, is feeding through into people wanting to have better decision-making, more fact-based decision-making. And I hope we'll see that reflected more in voting and electoral preferences in coming years.
I mean, we have reached globally 5 million cases that we know of. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Yeah. It's hard to see any positives in that, for me. Yeah. Christiana, you were going to jump in and say something about whether there are other parallels.
Well, the recognition of science is really important, as Tom has said. The other thing that I would just like to add to that is the lessons from COVID. We haven't harvested all of them yet, because while we're all locked behind our front doors at home and operating from a very isolationist mentality and attitude, because that is what science has recommended and that is what our governments have recommended. The fact is that we're not going to get through to the end of the tunnel here of COVID by this isolationist behavior. We are going to have to migrate over to much more of a collaborative space if we want to be able to develop the vaccines, develop them, produce them, and distribute them to 7 billion people, which is the only way that we will be able to return to normal behavior and normal interaction with each other. Mm. That vaccine part, which we haven't started because we're still trying to develop them, but the vaccine development, production, and distribution is not going to be done through isolationist mentality or through isolationist or individualistic attitudes and actions. It can only be done through collaboration. So I think the final lesson from COVID is not here yet. We will derive that lesson as we move into the vaccine stage next year. And it will be a pretty evident that collaboration is the name of the game for any global threat, whether it's a pandemic or whether it is climate change. It is going to be able to be solved only through collaboration.
I mean, those are two big ifs to watch in the coming months. Will international collaboration resume? And also the other big if is what we started this conversation with, the fundamental inequities that have revealed themselves during this pandemic. Will those be addressed by government leaders and the rest of us? Before we wrap up, and we literally have 3 minutes left before we wrap up, I want to just ask you, you've told us some of the things that you have done so far, right, to address your own emissions. What are the next 3 things that you plan to do in the months ahead, in the weeks ahead? And this could be individual things. It could be things you're doing as a community. It could be things you're doing as citizens of your country. Who wants to go first?
I can go first. Tom, do you want to jump in?
No, after you.
So I can give you two examples, personal and country-wise. I've actually moved into an old home and I'm renovating the home. And one of the first things I did was take a look at the water heater, which was an amazing, huge construction that was wrapped up in blankets, and I mean, it was just horrible. I wish I had taken a photograph of it. And of course, that water heater is gone. And I have highly efficient flow-through water heaters, despite the fact that electricity is completely clean. Just because electricity is clean doesn't mean that you waste electricity.
I love that. Yeah, in some ways, that's the perfect answer. It could be as basic as paying attention to your water heater. Solving the climate crisis starts with insulating your attic and looking at your water heater. Tom, very quickly before we have to jump off.
Okay, very quickly. So 3 things. There's a grant at the moment to put in electric charging points. I really want to buy myself an electric vehicle and transfer out of my car. I really love growing food. I've never been able to do it because I'm always traveling, but this year I've been able to do it. I'd love to do more of that. And the final thing is I've always felt completely incompetent whenever my clothes rip or my children's clothes rip. So I just had my mum teach me how to sew, and I'm going to be fixing my clothes from now on when they break.
That is ambitious. I want to thank both of you for joining us. I want to thank our audience for joining us and remind you all to please visit the bookshop at shop.edbookfest.co.uk. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Somini. Bye.